Welcome to this episode of Washington Policy on the Go. It's June 27th, 2023, and we've got a big show today with Todd Myers. Has been all over the media regarding the increase in gas prices that we've experienced in Washington State, taking over California's slot at number one in high gas prices in the nation for the first time. Well, the first time in my memory. Maybe it's the first time ever. We'll talk with him about that and his testimony yesterday at a legislative oversight hearing in the Tri-Cities that took a look at the Snake River dams, salmon recovery, amongst other things. We'll talk with him about that. Also, if you'd like to see the full video of that testimony or that hearing, that's available at washingtonpolicy.org. And then I want to remind you as well, we've got some new transportation analysis at washingtonpolicy.org. So if you're trying to keep track of the latest, be sure to subscribe to our free e-newsletter. And if you know someone who cares about state policy, who's interested in what's happening in the state and why, make sure that they're subscribing, even if they disagree with you a bit. Make sure they're subscribing to the Washington Policy Center's free e-newsletter on Fridays, because we provide a lot of information. And as Todd will explain a bit later in today's program, even while others might say that Washington Policy Center is all wet, after a while, when our analysis starts coming true, even our critics begrudgingly have to admit that that we're accurate. So have them sign up at washingtonpolicy.org. It's right at the top of the page. There's an option, sign up for our newsletter. That's what that is. So be sure to do that. We're going to start a conversation with Pam Lewison. She is our Director for Agriculture of our Agriculture Center here at Washington Policy Center. She has a number of developments to talk with us about. Let's start with wolves, Pam. One of the wolves is a funny thing because on the west side, I think people are romantic about wolves. They're kind of fascinated with the wildlife portion of it, but it's not a reality for them. You go to the east side, particularly the northeast side of the state, and it is a concern of the highest order for the people out there. And now the governor is thinking about taking some Washington state wolves and transplanting them to other states. You seem to say, hey, hold on for a second. Let's before we start shipping wolves elsewhere, we need to take a look at our own wolf status policy. Why is that? What's going on that has you saying, let's take another look?
So this came about because the governor of Colorado sort of sent out a request to have wolves brought to the state. They have a reintroduction policy that was just approved by voters, and they need gray wolves to help populate their state now, apparently. But the Washington side of it is interesting because the governor said, sure, we'd be open to discussion about potentially sending some of our gray wolf population your way. However, 2/3 of our state still has wolves listed as an endangered species on a federal level. And that final third, in the easternmost third, they are federally delisted, but they are not delisted by the state. And in fact, we haven't reached our population recovery goals as a state yet, even though wolves were reintroduced 21 years ago.
So your objection isn't really the sending of wolves elsewhere, if that's what they're asking for, although there might be people there that are like, hold on, why don't you just keep those wolves to yourself? The objection really is if we're not allowed to cull the wolf population in order to maintain, ranching and farming here in Washington State, then why would we be sending, the population elsewhere if it's that fragile? Is that
right? And I think that's the real problem is, 4 years ago, Representative Joel Kretz introduced a piece of legislation that proposed translocating wolves from his portion of the state, where they are everywhere, to Bainbridge Island. And it was sort of meant to be tongue in cheek about, hey, we're having to deal with this predator population that you all in Western Washington seem really amorous about, and we are not, because we have to deal with the reality of them day to day. So of course the legislation didn't go anywhere and people thought it was ridiculous and all this other stuff. But at the crux of that, there is also in our wolf management recovery documentation for the state, we are not supposed to, as a state, translocate wolves anywhere else to facilitate recovery of that animal within our state. There is a requirement for each identified region of the state, which includes us here in Eastern Washington, and then dispersal into Western Washington. So we effectively have wolves statewide as part of that recovery designation before they can be considered for state delisting. We don't really have any evidence of wolves yet on the west side of the Cascade Crest. So to be perfectly blunt, if we're going to pack wolves into a crate and transport them anywhere, it should be to Western Washington first. And then if the governor of Colorado wants to call us in a couple of years, then maybe there's time for a discussion then.
Interesting. There's a there's a part of me that I mean, I tend not to like the idea. There's part of me that likes the idea of having wolves on the west side so that I could hunt them. The other side of me is I took a hunting trip in Idaho where there was, an abundance of wildlife, elk, deer, and I was dropped off in the middle of nowhere with my dad, a special birthday thing, and I was stunned at how desolate everything was. I mean, there was just no deer, no elk, no tracks. And this is, 6 days in the middle of the wilderness, hiking around with 5 experienced hunters. There was nothing out there, and the people who, some of the more rugged people in the area out there just said once the wolves came in, it was gone. And there's a few things out at the cliffs near the riverbeds, another 6 to 8 miles into the wilderness, but that's about it. And frankly, after that experience, I believed him, because there was nothing out there. On Kretz's bill, that reminds me, I mean, this is kind of a sidetrack, Pam, so forgive me for this, but I remember researching wolves at one point and in my career, and there was a special kind of wolf. I guess the only, I can't recall if it's a subspecies or what, but the only ones left are over in Canada toward, I want to say Vancouver Island, or one of the islands out there, and they're beach-oriented wolves. So the idea of transplanting wolves to Bainbridge is not as weird as some might dismiss. They're only out there, and I think there was evidence of them having once been also on the San Juans and other islands in Washington. So maybe Kretz just should have shifted his legislation northward a little bit, hit up the San Juan, start there, and then work down toward Bainbridge. So
Bainbridge was intentional. You have certainly some legislators there who are for sure in favor of wolves as long as they're not in their backyard.
I'm sure the San Juans are the same, and there's an abundance of deer there. Although, to be fair, these beach dwelling wolves tend to focus on shellfish and other things that they find along the beach, which is kind of weird. So anyway, a sidetrack on this. I feel like that guy from Mutual of Omaha when I was a kid. On an unrelated note, leaving it there for a moment, because I take it there's no the governor hasn't made his decision. I should ask, do we know when the governor will make his decision on that, the final?
No, I think it depends on who you ask. Department of Fish and Wildlife is sort of trying to pump the brakes and say, hey, we have other things going on that we're trying to consider with gray wolves in our state population. Particularly, they've recently stated that they're open to perhaps a delisting in that easternmost third, so that they're in line with the federal delisting of gray wolves. So they're trying to wrap their arms around that, and then and then you have the governor's office saying, "No, we're fine. We'll talk about that all you want." So I think there's some miscommunication, and I think certainly there's some messaging problems that are going to come out of that.
So we'll keep an eye on that. Another item that you've been writing about is cell cultured meat, basically the Frankenstein meat that some have talked about, lab created meat. Instead of having a beet flavored impossible beef, you would have this new actual meat, but grown in a lab. What's the status on that, and how's that looking?
So I think it was actually 4 years ago, I wrote about the difference between cell cultured meat and sort of meat substitutes like Beyond and Impossible. And at the time, cell cultured meat was just sort of this rumor around that, there were companies that were experimenting with how to make it cost effective and affordable. The company formerly known as Memphis Meats, now called Upside, along with one other company, have just received USDA and FDA approval to sell cell cultured meat. So look for it. Right now, the rollout is exclusively in restaurants, where they're going to sort of test it to see if people can tell the difference ostensibly, and see what the market appetite is for it. But all the labeling and other regulatory hurdles they have to jump over have been cleared. So keep your eye out.
It'll be tough for them because, well, it's kind of like the popularity of some foods that say no GMO on there, or you'll see even meat labeled gluten-free, and, because there's some certain language that scares people regarding food. And I think lab created is going to be tough for them. So they'll probably, my own argument, I should trademark this before someone thinks of it, is to label some things eco beef. But I thought that about the McDonald's so-called pink slime that they were using for the eco meat would be the leftover gleaned processed food, little meat particles they were able to get off bones and stuff like that, because they're using it all over the place. But once it was labeled pink slime, there was all this backlash against it, which is why honey is called honey and not bee vomit, right? Because nobody's going to buy a jar of that to spread on their toast. So it's a weird thing. I think they're going to have trouble with the texture of this stuff, because muscles unused are going to be, I'll be very curious to see how it works.
I suspect that the texture will be something more akin to veal. I'm not a veal eater personally, but
me neither.
Something that's a little less muscular in nature. If I was going to put a marketing label on it, you could call it animal-free meat.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Effectively, what happens in this process is they extract cells from living animals, put them into a growth medium I hesitate to call it a petri dish, but that's
essentially
what it is, and feed it until it grows into a shape and size that they can put it into a mold, and then they mold it to make it look like, at this point it's just chicken, but they mold it to make it look like a chicken breast. So, and then, process it just like you would meat from a chicken.
When your kids grow up, and when our kids grow up and they're old enough and they're finally rebooting the Yellowstone series, imagine how boring it's going to be, because instead of having ranchers out there, it's just going to be some guy in a lab, growing the big, huge petri dish of meat. Kind of a weird thing. All right, on a serious note, let's get to the OFF Act, which you also wrote about recently. This is dealing with farming. It certainly sounds like a wonderful thing. You describe it though as a wolf in sheep's clothing. What does OFF stand for?
So the OFF Act is Opportunities for Fairness in Farming.
Oh, that's fuzzy, warm and fuzzy there.
Yes, one of the prime sponsors is Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey. He's a dedicated vegan, which I think is interesting that he'd be the prime sponsor for this piece of congressional legislation looking at checkoffs, which are primarily collected for ag products like meat and milk. And what this is sold as or billed as is a requirement or a demand for more transparency in our checkoff program. For people who don't understand what checkoff is, anytime a cow or something like that is sold, the producer pays a small fee to to the beef checkoff, um, to facilitate marketing and research on how to, grow animals more sustainably, how to better market them, and how to get the word out about things like, it's funny that we go from cell cultured meat to checkoffs, but how to better explain the benefits nutritionally and otherwise of cattle and other animals. So, and there are other checkoffs too. So, like the Christmas Tree Association also has a national checkoff as well. So anytime you buy a Christmas tree, a portion of what you're spending goes back to research and development for how to grow a better Christmas tree. And this bill would require the checkoffs to be more transparent. My argument with that is our checkoffs are pretty transparent already. So if you go to, for example, the Washington State Beef Commission and ask them for information about how they spend checkoff dollars for advertising or research, they will provide it to you. So this is taking that one step further and saying that they want that transparency on a federal level. But if you look at federal guidelines for all checkoff programs, that transparency is already there. You just have to choose to seek it out.
So is there a way that this could end up, let's say, it doesn't go anywhere at the federal level. Is there a way that this could be create a problem in Washington State?
I think so. Checkoffs are sort of work in tandem. So state and federal checkoff is collected at the same time. So anytime there's a transaction, a portion of that goes both to the state and then another portion to the federal side of things. So I think certainly it has the potential to be problematic when we look at how those funds are allocated and the sort of resources that are available. Our current Beef Commission has 2 full-time staff. So if we suddenly are asking them to somehow be more transparent than they already are, we're also asking them to spend more dollars on staff time rather than spending dollars where it's needed most, which is in that marketing and research space.
Here's a question from Heidi. Isn't the point of lab grown to reduce climate impact, but doesn't it actually take a lot of energy to grow?
So we don't really know what the the environmental impact of lab grown meat is, because it's never really been tracked, because it hasn't been available. That said, if you look at other alternative meat products like Beyond and Impossible, that was their original claim, was that they were, they were trying to lessen their environmental impact by sort of replacing or supplanting other sort of conventionally grown meat products. Research right now indicates that that's not the case, that their carbon footprint is similar or may actually be greater than, buying a cow off the hoof or a lamb or a goat or whatever your meat of preference is. So I think as lab grown meat gets borne out in the sort of longer haul, we'll have a better understanding of what that carbon footprint really is. I suspect that it will be similar to other alternative meat products.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Although, when you look at some other supposedly environmental policies, which I'm sure we'll discuss with Todd Myers coming up, it's not infrequent for advocates and politicians to get behind a policy that actually doesn't reduce carbon, even though they'll say it does, because they'll only count from a certain place in the chain, rather than for example, in the creation of light rail, all the cement and building and construction that goes into it. If you don't count that, things look a lot better, right? So it's not surprising that any industry is going to try to start to cherry pick their data point of when to start counting so they can look their utmost best.
I think it's also easy to label ag as being somehow more environmentally intensive, because we have hundreds of years of observational data that says X about a farm or a ranch, and we don't have that information readily available with such a long-term scope for these new and emerging products that are coming out. And I would really hesitate to get on board with anybody who says that anything is better for the environment than X, because you just don't know. It's too soon to tell. And I do think there is also, there are other hurdles aside from figuring out how to make something seem more pleasant than what it is. For me, I'll take a steak out of my freezer from our pasture any day of the week over something that was molded after living in a growth medium.
Well, also there's unintended consequences. I mean, let's say they master this and people decide, you know what, it might not be as good as a normal steak, but it's replacing ground beef in sirloin markets or something. Still once an animal is killed for its meat, the rest of that stuff is another way of marketing or of creating product for the whole animal, right? And then if there's less space needed, you might end up clearing forests or clearing or developing pasture land or other things that would have a negative impact. So these impacts are much harder they're not as simple and cut and dried. People like an either or choice, where there's this and that, but the real life situation can be far more complicated.
Yeah,
Pam, go
think,
ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that one of those things to consider in that sort of longer consequences train of thought is if you look at how we go about processing animals into meat and other, there's virtually no waste in that food system and in how we process things, because it is all useful and it has all been put to use doing something.
Yeah, and that was my whole argument about the pink slime controversy with McDonald's, and on that is it's like, when I was in school, I remember you'd learn about the Native Americans using all parts of the buffalo and what a great thing that was because nothing went to waste. Now, some of that's a myth, but the idea was, kind of caught your imagination and seemed like a great thing. And now the science is there to actually do it. And then once it's discovered, people are like, whoa, hold on there. I don't like the way you're doing that. That freaks me out. But I think a lot of that comes from the fact that most people have no real relationship with the gathering of their food for the first time in human history. Over the past 100 years or so, we've moved so far away from that. Whereas in all other times and places, people have had to grow or collect or kill their own food at some point in their lives. So this is, it's a wild change. So Pam, thanks so much for your time today, of course, and we'll keep everybody updated on all these crazy things happening.
All right, thanks, Dave.
Thanks. Let's go to Todd Myers. He is our Center for the Environment Director. He's been all over the news of late due to Washington State taking over the nation as #1 in gas prices with this crazy increase in prices of about 45 cents a gallon, which you'll all recall, based on the state's data of how much a ton of carbon would cost. Todd said, based on that, we can expect to see a 46 cent per gallon increase in gas and a 56 cent per gallon increase in diesel. And lo and behold, it's happening. And originally, when we talked about it, there was even a media outlet that labeled us false. I did the quote unquote fact check. We had politicians saying it's got to be pennies, just pennies, like the governor. We had staff officials from, state agencies describing Todd as what shall I use I'll paraphrase here, creative in his calculations and creative bordering on dishonest. And now the reality is that Todd, his analysis is within 1 cent of our current reality. Todd, how has this past week been in terms of satisfying for you? Because I remember at the time it was pretty frustrating seeing seeing the denial going on and the absurd denial of a reality based on a policy whose specific intention was to raise gas prices, and then everybody pretending that was not the intent of that policy.
Well, I'm sorry. I was over here. I was busily trademarking eco beef before you could get it.
That's a good plan. I've been talking about it for years because I thought, you know what, if you get a certain amount, instead of calling it pink slime or whatever, just, you could call it eco chicken, eco beef, eco meat, anything green related is good. I also like the animal free food. That was a good one. So,
well, I think calling it eco beef would be an example of strategic misdirection or misinformation.
Strategic language, yes. Strategic, yeah. That's a reference to Danny Westney's column.
Yeah, as you pointed out, for the last year, we have been saying, look, if the gas or if the prices per the CO2 allowances under the state's new system are this amount, it will amount to 46 cents a gallon. And the prices have gone to basically that. And guess what? It's almost 46 cents a gallon. This is not a difficult calculation. We've been saying it for a year. And what's interesting is that the Seattle Times did an interview about this and what's causing the fact that Washington State has had the highest gas, now for the first time ever, has the highest gas prices in the country. And they did a lot of talking with, Department of Ecology and other things like that. But in the middle of the article, they interview a guy named Severin Borenstein, who is a professor at Cal Berkeley, who is a part of their Energy Institute. He actually helped create California's CO2 cap and trade system. He's been appointed to federal bodies by Democrat presidents, by the governor of California has been appointed. So, I mean, he is a advocate of CO2 policies. And he told him, he said, well, the fact that this is raising gas prices is, his quote, beyond controversy. Of course it is, right? That's the purpose. And then he said, well, and so they asked him, well, like, how much does it increase? And he said, well, it's basically 1 cent per dollar per metric ton. So if the price is $50 a metric ton, that's about 50 cents a gallon. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, slightly less than that, but basically it's right. Well, that's what we've been saying for a year. And so the fact that here is one of the top energy experts on these issues in the country saying that it's beyond controversy is great. And then there was another article from the Energy Institute at Berkeley this week saying that all of this was expected because there was a report that was put out by the Department of Ecology saying, here's what we expect the prices per metric ton to be. And I emailed the guy and I said, that's exactly right. It was expected. We had been saying that. The only people who'd been saying that it wasn't true was the Department of Ecology, whose report it was. They projected 5 cents a gallon and completely nonsensically argued that natural gas prices would actually go down. So how you increase taxes on something and prices go down is a complete mystery to me, but they convinced themselves of that. So now, having been proven wrong, what are they doing? They're having to blame everybody else, oil company greed, all these things. And the question that I always ask the people who say that it's oil company greed is, okay, why is it that oil company greed is stopping at Washington State's borders? You're not seeing these increases in Idaho. You're not seeing them in Oregon, only in Washington. Are oil companies only greedy in Washington State? And then the other thing is that using data from last year, not since the CO2 tax has taken effect, the environmental community and the governor's press secretary said, oil companies are taking 85 cents per gallon in profit. Now, I think that's wrong, but let's just say that number is right. I think the number is actually more like 20 to 30 cents a gallon, but let's say their number is right. If they think 85 cents a gallon is outrageous, imagine what they must think about Washington State, which between the gas tax, which is one of the highest in the country, and the CO2 tax, which is the highest in the country, is about 93, 94 cents a gallon. So they're pointing to oil company greed when they are taking more per gallon than the oil companies. So I just think all of this is nonsense. They knew what the goal was. Now that the politics are coming home to roost, they want to blame everybody else for the intended outcome of their own policy.
Yeah, and they were allowed to mask this policy for a long time because they said it was going to be nothing but pennies. I remember, in our so-called fact check, you had officials being quoted as saying, it's not true because the officials say it's not true. I'm paraphrasing, but the absurdity of this, where we're taking the officials' word when prior to the policy being implemented, the argument for this policy everywhere is to raise the cost of driving so that people turn to other forms of transportation, mass transit or electric vehicles or whatever. I mean, it's a stated part of the policy. The other thing I found interesting about some of the columns that are now admitting that you're right, Washington Policy Center is right, that the prediction was close, is they have that caveat saying, well, the conservative leaning think tank, it's hard for Seattle to admit, but the conservative leaning think tank, and I thought, this is part of the problem with political conversation today, is there are some things that come out there's an opinion based on the data that's before you. And it can be through a conservative or a free market lens or a progressive or a liberal lens, or some other libertarian lens or what have you. But that's an opinion on what to do with the information you have. What you were doing is providing information based on a basic calculation. That's either right or wrong. I mean, it's not an opinion part of anything. And so I just thought it was interesting that people were still, they even have denial based on that. The inability to take a look at what things are factually, because it's coming from a resource they might not agree with wholeheartedly from the get-go.
Yeah. Well, if the conclusion is the people who are conservative get the numbers right and people who aren't conservative get the numbers wrong, so be it, I guess, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because that's the way it has turned out, right? Everybody is acknowledging, even as you said, Danny Westneat in the Seattle Times, who is certainly not conservative, acknowledged that we got it almost exactly right. So if they think saying, well, Todd Myers, a conservative, predicted it perfectly while nobody else did, okay, let's learn something from that.
Yeah. Now, there's a question from Heidi. She wants to know, is the Department of Ecology lying or incompetent on this?
So, yeah, this is what everybody asks me. So here's what I think. I think last year, when their report came out, the governor had already said it would be pennies. So there was political pressure on them to conclude the same thing. And I think that the Department of Ecology, let's just say that they're arrogant. The leadership is. I work with a lot of the staff, and I actually like the staff, but I think their leadership is arrogant and thinks that they're the experts, and everyone else is politically motivated, and they're just trying to save the planet. So, given that bias and perspective, and being surrounded by people who agree with that bias and perspective, they talked themselves into believing it would only be pennies. Now, I think that's bizarre because, like as I said, that's not the case in California. Nobody else, no other energy analyst says that, but I think they did talk themselves into it. And the reason I think that is because they literally sent a letter to a state senator saying it'll be about 5 cents. If you, at least if you're intelligent and you're lying, you don't put things like that in writing. They put it in writing, which indicates to me they actually believed it. Now, however, I think they're lying. I think they know that they're being dishonest, and that they're just spinning as fast as they can because there is such a trail of evidence showing that they're wrong that they're now just trying to spin. And the evidence, right? And they tried to destroy some of that evidence by taking all references to what the price impact would be off of their own webpage. And of course, now what their message is, oh, this is all very confusing. There are so many factors. There's Ukraine, there's the markets, it's too confusing to make a projection. Well, that wasn't their attitude last year. Last year, their attitude was, it's 5 cents a gallon, and anybody who says otherwise just doesn't understand what they're talking about. Now, all of a sudden, it's too confusing for anybody to make a judgment. But as we know, California very openly says, here's what it costs. The energy experts I've talked about, along with other energy experts, very clearly say, here's the cost impact. Only the Department of Ecology is pretending like it's too difficult to understand.
So is it worth it, Todd? Are we getting 50 cents, 45 cents per gallon? And what if people, just before the show started, we were talking off air about how much every individual in Washington state has paid so far, based on how much the state has collected on this. Has it been worth the money in terms of environmental benefit?
So people argue about whether the price, which is actually $56 a metric ton, is more or less than the harm done by CO2 emissions. There's a thing called the social cost of carbon, which attempts to estimate the damage done by CO2 emissions to the planet. Some of those estimates are higher than $56 a metric ton, some are lower. So that I think is a very complicated calculation with a lot of uncertainty. So I won't argue whether that is the case or not. Perhaps my dog, who has just joined me, will, but we can talk about that later. But the real question is, could we be getting more for less? And that answer is absolutely yes. I mean, California's CO2 taxes are less, or no, not quite less, almost half what we pay. And so they are getting, the same amount of CO2 reductions for about half the price. The other thing that we could do is allow more investment in technology that can reduce CO2 emissions for like $2 to $3 a metric ton, as opposed to the $56 a metric ton we're paying right now. So when you hear people say, this is a crisis, this is an existential crisis, there is no time to wait, clearly that's wrong. They're happy waiting because we could get 10, 20 times as much CO2 reduction by using other strategies than the one we're doing now. But again, the governor and the legislature, they don't care that the price is high, because the higher the price of the tax, the more money goes into their own pockets. And it's funny because I saw something complaining that says, oh, this is oil company greed. Oil companies make $50 per person in profits a year. Washington state thus far has made $111 for every person in Washington state in new taxes in 6 months. They love that. They want high tax values, high cost of CO2, because all of that money goes into their pocket. But they have prioritized money for government over effective environmental policy.
Question from Bob: has the governor had anything to say about this, given recent acknowledgments, or will it be another, well, that's news to me?
So I haven't seen anything he's said. His spokespeople have been spinning very hard, blaming the oil companies, which is not surprising. That's what they always do. The governor was asked a question at a press conference earlier this year about the increase in gas prices and the impact. He just started pounding the podium and screaming about Exxon. That's their strategy, is to sort of lie as fast as they can, and to, try to make sure that the policy stays in place. So he has not, but, his staff have done the predictable blame literally everybody but themselves.
We had a humorous Twitter exchange at Washington Policy Center with the Washington State Senate Democrat caucus. And sometimes caucus staff go beyond representing all their members. So who knows? But this is the official account from them, saying that basically they were condemning the analysis that there's this 45 cent per gallon increase, because Washington Policy Center is just this, supposed to be a tool of the oil industry. And we pointed out that British Petroleum helped craft the legislation for cap and trade and so-called cap and invest for the governor, that they were really a huge part of the creation of the statute, and no response to that from them. But it is funny how there's the instant, it's the oil company's fault. Oh, by the way, the oil companies, one big one, the biggest in the world, helped craft this policy. What do you think of that? Oh, crickets, so.
Yeah. Which also had the largest oil spill in the history of the planet.
And there's that too. Quick question coming in. Where can we see where the money is going from this?
So I did an analysis of the expenditures prior to the end of the session that found that about half of the money in the proposed budgets that was dedicated to, or that was from the cap and trade, from the tax on CO2 emissions, went to government expansion, more people for planning and bureaucracy and all those sorts of things. So I need to do an update on that. But the other thing is that when the session ended, they knew that the prices were higher than they expected, but they didn't know about this most recent auction, and then they don't know about the auction in August and then December, I think, or November is the last one. Anyway, so they didn't have a good sense of how much revenue they were getting. Next year, with all of this gusher of new money that they didn't expect, I expect that they're going to spend lots and lots more money. The thing I am certain that they won't do is cut taxes, but what is in the budget, I think, is not reflective of what the actual expenditures and costs will be, because they're getting so much more money than they expected.
One thing I find frustrating personally is since I was very young, the state's talked about how the roads and bridges are in disrepair in Washington State. Our bridges are rated very low for safety. There's earthquake dangers because there's so many. We're overdue for a major earthquake and all this kind of thing. And then, of course, there's a number of places where we need some highway expansion and other things. And this money, unlike the gas tax, which is dedicated to roads, highways, and road maintenance, this money does not do any of that. But it does take away from the resource, and it's a zero-sum game because there's only so much you can drain from commuters. And this is just such a massive amount taken. I mean, a near doubling of the tax that they're paying on gas per gallon, without that benefit to our infrastructure, which is essential for employment, and everything else that's happening in the state. So I love how you point that out, and I'll point it out again. Before we run out of time, Todd, I wanted to say I saw your testimony yesterday at the Legislative Oversight hearing for the House Subcommittee on Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries in Richland, in the Tri-Cities. And I mean, all that was missing was a mic drop. I thought that your testimony in the 5 minutes there was just devastating toward those who want to stop or want to breach the dams, the Lower Snake River dams. I thought it was just tremendous. But you said you took a couple of things out of that testimony that have been frustrating to you. What was missing from that testimony, and how did that hearing come about?
Yeah, so there was a field hearing, which means members of Congress get out of Washington, D.C. and go to where the issues are. They took a tour of the Ice Harbor Dam, which is the one closest to the Tri-Cities of the 4 Snake River dams, to look at how that works. And then they invited 8 of us to testify on the issues. So I was there talking about sort of the impact on salmon and the state of salmon in the Snake and then across the Pacific Northwest. So 2 things that I did point out that I'll mention, and 2 things that I didn't, which I'll add here. But the first is that, the environmental community and others have constantly claimed, oh, we're on the edge of extinction. We are on the edge of extinction. Salmon only have a few years left unless we do something. Well, of course, you can't tear down the dams that fast anyway. So if that's true, we're already in trouble. But their predictions have been consistently wrong. And so I just pointed out that in 2019, the environmental community said that, salmon populations were going to decline. That year, I wrote an op-ed with Governor Inslee's former salmon advisor that salmon populations on the Snake would go up because they're part of a cycle and we're at the bottom of the cycle. Well, guess what? Over the last 3 years, salmon populations have gone up. it's not because I'm a genius. It's just because I look at the data and say, here's what the data are. The other thing that I pointed out is that the Nez Perce and others were claiming that wild Chinook rather, were going to decline steadily until 2025 and they would be functionally extinct. Well, that turns out not to be true. Last year, the population doubled. I pointed out those things as keys. One other thing I pointed out is that the environmental community says that the dams increase temperatures. I did a look at the data from 2007 to 2019, and I found that the temperature impact was not only very small, that the temperature impact that there was in the middle of summer, which is between the key runs of the spring and summer Chinook and the fall Chinook. And that lastly, the temperature impact that you could see on the dams had been declining over the last 15 years because the Army Corps of Engineers has done a better job of figuring out how to keep temperatures low. So all of that I wanted to make sure I pointed out. The two things that I cut, one was there was a claim that what are called smolt to adult return ratios are better on the Yakima than they are in the Snake River. And what they say is, oh, look, the percentage of salmon that return after their life to the Yakima is much higher than the Snake River. That means that the Snake River dams is what is causing the death. So I happened to be chatting with the person who runs salmon recovery for the Yakima a few weeks ago. We were talking about a variety of things about the challenges that salmon in the Yakima River face. And I said, hey, what do you think about this? I think why are you guys getting such good returns on salmon compared to everywhere else? And his answer was, we're not. The data that show that were for a very brief period of time, and they are no longer true, and that in his judgment, their returns are actually worse than the snake now. So but despite that, the Spokesman Review today had somebody quoting the Yakima River as being better. And I kicked myself that I pulled that out of my testimony, my oral testimony, because I could have addressed that. It's in my written testimony, but it's not in my oral testimony. And then the other thing I wanted to say is that, which is my mantra, which is that technology is working. 96 to 98% of salmon successfully pass each dam because we have good data and good technology that has helped us figure out how to make that work. That's a tremendously high percentage. And if you talk about spending, $10 billion to remove a dam, and you're only getting 2% increase in fish passage, right? That's just not worth it. And so I wanted to put in a plug for the work of the Pacific Northwest National Labs and others whose technology has, created those fantastic results. And that's where we need to focus rather than destroying dams.
I'll also note that the way you started your testimony was an analysis of a river where there's declining population and it's a disaster. And it sounds like you're talking about the Lower Snake, and then it turns out you're talking about a different river that had no dams at all. It was the Snohomish River, and you're just pointing out there's no dams here, but there's a problem with salmon throughout the Puget Sound, and there's a need to address the challenges that salmon in the Puget Sound have. And one of them you've pointed out before has been the overabundance of predators that go after those salmon. And we're not talking about the endangered orcas, we're talking about the seals and other things.
We want the orca to eat more.
Yeah, we want the orca to have more salmon to eat, and we want fewer seals out there, just because they have no natural predator. So in this area anyway. So that's been very difficult. Also, I noted that in this, you also mentioned the Elwha, because the Elwha has been kind of romanticized as this is the place where the dam's taken away. We're a decade out now. It seems like yesterday, by the way. It's kind of shocking. This is what happens when you get old. Time flies too fast. But those dams were taken away 10 years ago. And, the implication was that by now we should be seeing a return to pristine, conditions of not seen anywhere but Alaska. But instead, we're looking at a deeply troubled ecosystem still.
Right. So there were two dams on the Elwha. They had zero fish passage. So fish could not get upstream at all. That's of course not true with the Snake River dams. As I said, fish get upstream, 98%, 96 to 98% pass down. There's fish ladders that they can go up. They can access all of that and get into Idaho. That was not true with the Elwha. 0% were getting down. So if there is a textbook study of what removing a dam should look like and open up habitat, it is the Elwha. But here we are 10 years later, and Chinook have not recovered. Their 2022 was below the 10-year average, about very similar to the average before the dams were torn down. 95% of the fish are still hatchery fish. So one of the arguments is that removing the dams increases wild fish populations. There's lots of arguments about wild fish are better than hatchery fish. We'll get into those, but the argument is that destroying the dams helps wild fish. Well, here we are a decade later. Right, 95% are still hatchery fish. And then in my written testimony, I pointed out that an assessment said that it wasn't just destroying the dams was the strategy. It was they're not fishing. They haven't been fishing for Chinook in 10 years on the Elwha, and they're still not. A hatchery supplement, a variety of other things, all have contributed to it. So the only reason I made that point is not to say that we never should have torn down the Elwha dams. Like I said, if you're going to give an example of where tearing down the dams can help, it's probably the Elwha. It is simply to say destroying dams is not a silver bullet. Even in the best case scenario, it doesn't yield returns quickly, and it doesn't suddenly displace hatchery fish and have wild fish. So the notion that tearing down the Snake River dams is all we need to do to fix the Snake River is just a fantasy.
Before I let you go, there's one more question that's come in from a listener. Does the $111 per person that the government is now collecting, thanks to cap and the so-called cap and invest, cap and trade system, does it include the money they're receiving from agriculture, considering the agriculture is supposed to be exempt from the tax?
Yes, it does. The simple answer is yes, it does. The reason it does is because the people who have to buy the allowances, who set the prices at auction, bid based on their expected obligations, their liabilities, how many permits they need to cover the CO2 emissions from the gasoline that they're selling. Right now, that gasoline includes for exempt industries like agricultural, like marine, things like that. So that's doing two things. One, not only is it charging agriculture and these other industries that are supposed to be exempt, it's increasing the total prices because it is artificially inflating supply of credits. So, right, the Department of Ecology is not in a hurry to solve this problem. I guess that they have had a recent meeting where they're talking about how to do this. But up until recently, they have, again, been blaming everybody else but themselves and saying this is not our problem. Now they have, I guess, taken some positive steps to look at that, and hopefully they'll come up with a solution. But the short-term result has been that the state has more money because the higher demand means higher price for allowances and more tax revenue.
Well, Todd, thanks for all your work. It's been great to see your work picked up nationally, and thanks California for being so high for so long and giving us this comparison to finally get the truth out about Washington state policy. Hopefully you'll be back to number one soon, California, but as of now, Washington state gets to brag about being number one in gas prices for the nation. So thanks, Todd. I appreciate it. And I want to thank everybody else for tuning in to Washington Policy on the Go. Remember, we're outside of the legislative session. It's every other week. So we'll see you in 2 weeks with another edition. And be sure to send friends and everybody who's interested in policy that you know to washingtonpolicy.org. Make sure they sign up for our newsletter. It's easy, right there at the top of the homepage. And within every blog, there's a sign-up opportunity for people. They can get on our email list and they won't miss the key information, the news about state policy that they need to be informed here in Washington state. Thanks for watching.